As we dive deeper behind the scenes of security and cybercrime today, interviewing top leaders from around the world and sharing true cybercrime stories to raise awareness. But first, a huge thank you to all of our executive co-producers who subscribed to our Prime membership and fueled our growth. So please help us keep this going by subscribing for free to our YouTube channel and downloading our episodes on Apple or Spotify podcasts so we can continue to bring you more of what matters. This is Cybercrime Junkies, and now the show. All right, well, welcome everybody to another episode of Cybercrime Junkies. I am your host, David Morrow, and very excited today. We've got Ryan Leirvik joins us in the studio. He's the CEO of Neuvik and author of Understand, Manage, and Measure Cyber Risk, Practical Solutions for Creating a Sustainable Cyber Program. Ryan's got decades of experience as a cyber expert, worked for McKinsey Company, and was formerly with the US Dept of Defense at the Pentagon, where he served as Associate Director of Cyber and Chief of Staff. Ryan, welcome to the studio. Very excited to have you, man.
Thanks for having me, David. I'm very happy to be here.
Oh, that's great. And if you ever want me to attend all of your Zoom meetings and do that intro for you, I'm happy to do that.
You do it so nicely.
Thanks. It's and then I can just be like, and here's Ryan, and then I'll just drop off the studio.
Oh, well, you have much more to contribute than that, but I appreciate the intro. It's so eloquent.
That's great. So you've got a new book, and we're going to get to that in just a second. Or you got an update for a book that is really interesting and right along the lines of everything that we talk about in this platform. But so we were talking backstage about musical theory and learning instruments and how learning the fundamentals and the like learning music, it's so much easier when we learn how to read music, how to play classical guitar, and then it makes it easier to do the fun things like blues and rock and things like that. And you were a drummer, your wife is a guitarist. Tell the listeners a little bit about that.
Yeah, and for those that don't know, David learned classical guitar early on and then made all the other derivatives easy. And we were talking about this, and the reality is it's very much like any practice, but not that different than cyber, right?
Yeah.
The more that you know the strict fundamentals, it makes everything that sits on top of those fundamentals much easier to understand, right? Like one way to look at it is from the cybersecurity space, we can come at it and look at it just from the threat side. Right. It's like, hey, let's look at all the threats in the world. Okay, well, you can go crazy trying to figure out
it's a great rabbit hole to go down to. It's just amazing.
Yeah, super fun, right? It's like being able to play all of the solos that you want to play from all the great guitarists.
That's a great analogy. That's exactly what it is. It's like put the spotlight on, play the solo, everything else. But if you don't know how to do rhythm, how to read the music, what the beat is, the cadence, how it's all mixed and engineered, you don't know where that fits in, right?
Exactly. There's no context.
Yeah.
Right? It's like, oh, that sounds great, but how does this fit into the broader, song or, theatrics of whatever's actually happening? And that's kind of the way cyber is, right? If you lose the fundamentals of do we know, let's even start with, do we know even what the risk is to know even does that threat even matter to us, right? Do we have a way of managing that risk? Yes or no, right? If yes, great. If no, well, we better get something. And then of course, do we have measures that tell us how are we actually managing that? And those are, some of the fundamentals in cyber that very much, apply to almost any practice, but also music,
Absolutely. So I want to ask you kind of, how did you first, was there an event when you were younger that drove you to want to be in cyber defense, be in technology generally? Is there something, I mean, everybody has some people have a specific event. They remember when this happened, or they started gaming as a child and then they started hacking, and then the feds knocked on their door and they realized, I don't want to be on the wrong side, I'm going to go be on the right side. One of the two, because Club Fed is not as nice as they make it seem in the movies. What is it? How did you get your inspiration for it?
Yeah, great. My story is sort of a combination of three things. sort of a naturally deviant, how does this break mind with
Yeah.
a love of technology for optimization and automation.
Right. Just leveraging the advances of it. Like, right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then layered on top of this, oh, this is how individuals could use this for either, unintended use or use it for malicious need.
Well, and that's a good point too, right? Like that, not to go down a rabbit hole here, but a lot of these breaches that we read about or that we hear about, sometimes it's happened just from kind of negligence or just error, as opposed to something that has this long deviant kind of modus operandi behind it. I mean, maybe there's a modus operandi from the threat actor, but how it actually happens isn't necessarily always complete negligence on behalf of the company or the organization. Sometimes it's just pure kind of error.
That's right. Yeah, it's really sort of a combination of pieces that come together that allow the attacker to take action on objectives. I mean, that's really it at its most fundamental level. But David, the interesting thing here is that usually there's a combination. Those combination of pieces start with business decisions on what technology are we going to use.
Right.
Okay, great. 2, have we thought through how we need to protect whatever we're connecting that technology to or using it for? All right. And then 3, okay, have we spent enough time or spent enough resources at a sufficient level to say, effectively we accept the risk that may go above or below that level? And that sounds wildly, theoretical, right? But it's completely practical in a sense that, the medieval folks did this a long time ago with the tower structure, right? Thinking through, hey, we need to protect the towers. So let's think through what an attacker is going to do and build that while we're building the castle. So you have stairs that go along the wall counterclockwise, because it's really hard for a right-handed person to swing a sword when there's a wall against you, right?
Right.
And it's just that thinking up ahead starts at the business layer, which is what technology are we going to put in place and what's its intended purpose? What are we connecting to it? Okay, do we have a sufficient level of security? And then we just layer all those technologies on top of those technologies, and expecting them to work properly would be, somewhat of a
wishful thinking.
That's right. Yeah, if we hadn't thought through some of the ways that it might be used in unintended ways.
So let me ask you this: in your consulting with organizations, and does your firm consult mostly with enterprise organizations, or is it also in the SMB space?
Anybody with a computer and a network will help.
Okay, yeah, that's like our team. Yeah, it's just like, are you connected? Okay, let's help. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. So, what is your take then about how some of the decisions were originally made when they were purchasing a lot of these platforms, or a lot of this technology? Did they have those? Were they asking the questions back when they bought it, do you feel? Or are they trying to address it post-sale, post-integration on how to shore it up?
Yeah, David, great question. And I would love to paint every single organization and business decision with the same brush, but it's impossible.
Right. Yeah,
right.
Isn't it?
And this is it. And this is where we see the effects of those decisions in maturity cyber, in organizational maturity for a variety of different organizations. So take, for example, we all use banks as sort of in the commercial space, some of the most mature, right? Largely because
they had to be. Right. Like, like if and this gets into something you and I've been talking about, and that is there's so many rules. Like if you're doing something and you're going to commit a crime, you know what the law is, right? The law is pretty clear. You can't steal, you can't do this, you can't do that. But in the cyber realm, right, an organization doesn't have a crystal clear set. Now, like the banking industry of all, right, the finance industry of all has the most sets of, regulations and rules in which to have those guardrails are. But most organizations, at least here in the US, don't really have that right now. We have a lot of guides. We have a lot of controls. We have a lot of ideas. And some organizations apply NIST, some will apply CIS, some will apply this one, that one. And it's confusing to a lot of leaders.
100%. And directionless a lot of times, so in the banking world, there's an easy side, which don't kick me, everybody who's in the banking side, that you have those regulations and oversight to sort of keep, the banking system working the way it is. On the management side, that'll drive you completely insane because of all of the regulation you have to point to. And if you spend all your resources there, guess what? The attackers know that you're paying attention to those and they'll just slip right past them.
Right.
But it's easier in the sense that you have direction and guidance and at least a scaffolding. Then there's sort of now it's changing, right? We see the SEC laws, we know New York Department of Financial Services and some California pieces, like they've been changing. But for everyone else that isn't in a heavily regulated environment, right, to include oil and gas and energy production, right, they were regulated on different sides, but not necessarily on the IT or OT space, right?
Right.
And the challenge for that is, as mind-numbing as it can be in sort of the banking and over-regulated space for the IT, in the rest of the world, or rest of the industries, if you will, there's this challenge of like, well, what do I do? And so, if we look sort of historically into the decision making that may have been going on, your question is, well, who's making the decisions, right? And how informed are they and what the impact to the business is? Because you have these competing drivers for business, right? One is we need to maximize our mission, whatever that is, right? Revenue share,
growth, market share, market cap, whatever it is.
That's right. Yeah. And even for nonprofits, we want to advance our mission of whatever social piece you're doing. And you're not thinking about, oh, what do I need to do this business well? What will impact my business should it not be available, right? Or be disrupted in some way. And then what are the technologies I'm putting in place and how are they protecting them? It's not really top of mind, right? For a lot of decision makers, right? And so you get this conflation of, the IT person's like, hey, we want this because I really like it. It works well, whatever. Versus a business decision where it's like, well, what's the cost and how is it going to help me advance my mission? And somewhere in there, unless there's a security-minded individual that says, hey, we're going to put some really important information on this or connected to it, right? Or connected to something that is actually important to the business, then the security thinking sort of gets lost or is assumed, right? Like, oh, I'm going to buy this IT product, right? From this IT vendor who's pretty well known. They must have thought through security, right? And we all know, like, checking the assumptions is where the real power lives, right? But the issue there is like the security thinking isn't really, there in the beginning. So we've seen this maturity using various industries as examples, and then the fines and regulations have helped with the guidance piece, and you've got this conflation of all those categories, and for one decision of what particular networking gear should we use, or how should we set up our internal network in the first place, which may or may not even been a business decision, but more of a tech decision. Right. And so it's challenging for a lot of organizations without any guidance, to understand what the fundamentals might be and what needs to be paid attention to.
Yep. So your book, Understand, Manage, and Measure Cyber Risk, I will tell you that it is really practical. Like, it really is. Like, I'm reading it and I'm like, yeah, it's like a book. Like, if I was going to synthesize everything I've been learning, and Mark and I have been learning in our team as we digest all these episodes, right? Like, we could have your book up almost next to it. Like, I'm like, this is really good. Like, so congratulations on that.
Oh man,
wish
David,
you
thanks
like
so much.
tons of success on it, and we'll have links to it in the show notes. And I'll tell you, this is a book that's really interesting. If you're not super technical, or even if you are, you really lay it out in very realistic terms. Like, this is what this means. This is why we need to make this change. It was really good. I wanted to ask you, what drove you to write it, other than being like, you have incredible background in history. And I know there's some things you can't talk about from being in the Department of Defense, but I'm going to get into those because I've got to ask some things about it. But what drove you to write a book in the first place? Like, what was it?
Yeah, it was the absence of this kind of practical thinking that was out there, coming out of the department, right, which is highly regulated, very specific, right, and you have rules and regulations on all sides of you, into the corporate space. With the banking, we had it, but didn't have it 100%, and then to the rest of the community, like, wow, there's really this missing, this very practical thinking of like, at whatever point of the problem I'm in as a practitioner, I need a guidance. I need some sort of guidance to go to, just to orient me in some direction, or provide scaffolding of like, this is a way of thinking about it, categorically, to then bring it back to the business and start to put those things in. I've noticed after 3.5 years of probably talking to, I track it, but somewhere around 300 to 400 CISOs, legitimately, individually, right? And practitioners, there was the budding question of like, how do I communicate to the business what the impact is of the work that I'm doing?
That's exactly right. That making of an internal business case, right?
That's right.
It's that explaining all this complex, right? All this complexity of systems and platforms and controls and guidance and the people and the staff and all of that into what it really means for the business.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest struggles. That's what it appears to me.
It is. And this is where, just like you've experienced, I was experiencing the same thing. And I thought, I started to write these pieces down and make the construct of like, all right, what's the risk? How are we managing it? How are we measuring it? In all of my conversations. So honestly, I just started to write it all down and put it down in pieces and use it as a guide. So when I was having conversations with those struggling with these problems, I could provide them with some guidance, and then realized, it was actually took a friend of mine was just like, hey, you need to publish this as a book. I'm like, okay, great. Sounds good.
A lot easier said than done, isn't it?
Oh my
It's
gosh.
like, dude, you had no idea recommending that, like the rabbit hole I had to go down to make that happen. Wow.
That is right. And thank you for the compliments like that. I hope every reader gets that out of it, because that was what the thinking that went into it. It's like, if I'm going to spend this kind of time like producing something that, somebody's going to have to pick up and read, it better hit the point fast.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so I spent a lot of time synthesizing the points to say, okay, where in the problem are you? And here's some guidance to it. So hopefully, it's meant to be wildly fundamentally practical, right? Yeah. And not a recipe for, this is the way to, bake this particular pie. It's like, hey, you need ingredients. Ingredients might look like this, right? Pies, the ingredients are going to react in these different ways. Like, here's how to actually put it all together, depending on who you're serving and what their, tastes are, which is, every business is different, right?
Yeah, it is. Without a guide like that, though, without some synthesis of what is going on, I don't know how business leaders, right, those the captains of industry that are driving our economy, I don't know how they would know where to start. Because if you get online or you pick up a magazine or whatever, there's like, well, MFA is really important, and then this is really important, and do we have Move It, and do we have this, and like, there's so many different things. You don't know what is going to be, what you need to do next. What do we do now? What do we plan for next year? And you break it up into a host of different sections. The three that I found really important was like, what is the problem? Why is it complicated? And then a great section was like, questions boards should ask. I thought that was really practical. Like, kind of, what should business leaders, right, the ones that are actually ultimately decision makers or voting makers, what should they be asking their CISOs? Right.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that. How do you boil that down? Kind of like in questions boards should ask.
Yeah, David, thanks for teasing that particular part out, because it's a big question that almost everybody's asking, right? The board member, because I think of it this way, right? To your point, it's almost like it's hard to understand this space as it's continuing to mature if you haven't been around it a long time, right? So in the absence of real information, like, okay, what's the reality of the problem I'm trying to solve? Imagine this way, right? You have board members out there that are really smart people. That's why typically they're on the board, but may not have an understanding of this problem so well. So they're asking questions like, hey, what do I really need to do to understand that the organization understands the risk well and is mitigating it in a way that's sufficient? Because as a board member, I'm, providing oversight, right? To the C-suite, which is, hey, we've got a business to run, right? And we got to make sure that we don't have a risk that takes us out, right? I mean, Move It is, you've seen the
I've been following Move It from the beginning. As soon as we saw it, we kind of got together and we're like, "Holy cow! This has potential to be like another SolarWinds or worse because of where everybody was using this." And Move It, for those that don't know, is that file transfer platform that sends highly confidential information encrypted on both ends. The problem is it's been exploited. Vulnerability that occurred last spring got exploited by none other than Klop, the Russian-based ransomware gang, and they haven't really even been launching their ransomware through it. They've just been stealing it and extorting, and then leaking the data, and it's widespread. It's growing like a mushroom cloud.
Yeah. Unbelievable. Yeah, your coverage on this has been unbelievable. So for any of those that haven't seen it, like go back to previous episodes and listen to David's coverage, and this has been great. And it's like, that's it. So, and that was a widely used platform. So you can think of business leaders who are like, hey, other people are using it. Great. Let's use this. So you have the decision makers of the executives trying to figure out, hey, how my CISO or CIO or CTO or whomever is actually making the recommendations on IT infrastructure, right? Coming to me with these thoughts. Okay, great. Like I'm going to do the economics, right, from the business side, but I may not be asking the security questions, right? And then you've got the CISO, right? Or sorry, I keep saying that as a general term, but like a director of information
it's
security.
It's the security IT decision maker, right?
Exactly.
That advisor, that consigliere for IT and security.
Precisely. And they're imagine where they are. Like, what does the board need to hear? Because I can bring them a whole bunch of data, and I can put them to sleep for 7 days straight, just telling them all of the different network and cloud infrastructure and SOC data that I have, and just that I really like, but they're going to be bored. And so that particular part of the section of the book is just like, look, the boards, if they ask these questions from a top-down point of view, right, give you an indication of probing into the organization to say, is the organization thinking about security in a way that impacts the business so that they can mitigate it properly? And there's a handful of questions in that particular tear sheet, really, to like for any board member to say, hey, these are the questions I could ask. It's like an investigation, right?
It's really good, because what I liked about it is kind of like a tear sheet. Like any board, even a SMB, ownership in an SMB could kind of take that, and then when their IT advisor, whether it's an MSSP or an MSP or their IT guy or whatever, even at that SMB level, they can ask those same questions, and then at least be able to make more I don't want to say educated, but more a better advised business decisions.
That's exactly it. Start somewhere. It's the starting sheet. And many organizations may say, like, oh yeah, we're way past this. Great, good,
right.
Keep going, right? Others, and especially in the SMB space,
they're not even, they don't know to ask some of these questions.
Yeah, it hasn't filtered all the way down to those that are like very mature to to those that can actually come together. And those three pieces normally don't talk except at the board meetings, right?
Exactly.
And you get this filtered game of telephone sometimes of like, well, the board asked for this and the executives want to sort of say this, and the engineers typically and the IT folks underneath want to present that, and there's this immediate tussle between all three of them. And so that was simply meant to be, these are the categorical things to ask for, probe deeply. And especially if you're in the small, medium business side of the house, it's like, hey, start here. And all of a sudden you get everybody on the same page. Now you can start to move forward. I mean, there's no sense to quote, like reinvent the wheel and do what everybody's been doing. Just start there and then, and then refine it over time, right? It's not this list of like, these are the things you always ask. Start there, you get going. And then from there, as you say, you start to learn, oh, these are the types of risks that the business should be paying attention to. Oh, these are the types of threats that actually can exploit certain types of vulnerabilities that we have that have impact on the business. Oh, that's what our risk is. Yes. Yeah, that's the risk. Okay, now we're on the same page.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So let me ask you, let's before we jump back, I wanted to ask you about Move It. We were talking about Move It. And it was a 0-day kind of vulnerability that occurred. and then they came out and they patched it, and then they were still getting exploited, and it just keeps growing, and it just keeps getting worse, and it's really not good. It's affected every single industry, including 3 of the 4 biggest um, consulting firms, even the silk stocking consulting firms like Deloitte, Ernst & Young, you name it. And then also there's class action suit that got filed last week by a consumer rights firm, I think in New York or Boston, I think Boston. And then the U.S. government's got like a $10 million bounty on the heads of anybody that can lead to an arrest or indictment of somebody involved in CLOP, which is great to hear, but we all know that's very rare to happen unless somebody actually travels and makes a mistake, right? One of these guys gets on a plane, goes to Miami, hey, we got you. But let me ask you this. What, in your section of the book where you talk about what is the problem, and you point to some of these things, but how could that have been avoided? How do we avoid a future Move It or SolarWinds event?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
Or Log4j. Yeah.
Or Log4j. Yeah, exactly.
And this is the challenge. So I'm going to flip it. I'm going to answer the question. I'm going to flip it through a different lens.
Makes sense.
Back to the fundamental pieces, right? These are really challenging because we rely heavily on our third parties, right, to provide either IT infrastructure, right, or services. And we know from the defense industrial base, Lockheed sort of helped kick this off years ago in 2014, I think, of like, hey, okay, third party risk is a big deal. Right. When one of our fighters,
and I think that wasn't the Target breach. The Target breach occurred from the HVAC vendor, not from Target.
That's right. Yeah. And then we had the Target one later on. So quickly on third party risk. Yeah. The first was sort of like the defense industrial base. Hey, China just showed a fighter that looks a lot like one of ours. What happened? Oh, okay. That was found on, somewhere. And it's because of a third party to the DoD, right? Then later, that's a big one because it has to do with national defense. The second big sort of monumental one was the Target breach, which was, the black point of sale used or black POS. It had a couple different names used on the point of sale systems, right? That sort of leaked data low and slow. That's theoretically came from an HVAC vendor plugging into the system, right? And what's interesting there, though, in that latter part, is that now all of a sudden board members became, I don't think liable is the right term, but like 1 or 2 people lost. I mean, we saw the CEOs get fired and be frazzled on TV, which is, that taught us, hey, we need to be prepared for these type of things. But 2, board members had fiduciary responsibilities, and that sort of put the board on the map or in the target zone, no pun intended, of third-party risk, right, or of a cyber breach. So all of a sudden it spun off this whole third-party risk management piece, like almost immediately, where all the organizations, big organizations, got together and said, all right, how do we look through our third parties? That includes supply chain, by the way, right? I nest them together. The community hasn't quite, is divided on that. And my view of this, just for everybody listening, is like, third party risk includes supply chain, risk management, because that's third parties and fourth parties and nth parties, right, down the line. And the issue then becomes, well, how do we have confidence in the systems and the technologies, or even the people and the services that we're bringing into the organization, right, that they have a sufficient level of security? Now, that's a really hard question, because we haven't even, at that point, you haven't even figured out for the organization yet. Now you're going to ask other organizations to do it.
Right.
Yeah.
And is that through policy, or is that through in the vendor selection process? Like, how does an organization do that?
Great question. And not easily, because you have to apply resources to it. But there's 3 major things that matter, right? One is, what are we buying, right? And why, right? That's a business decision, right? We need to outsource this, or we need to purchase that. I mean, effectively, those are the 2 big categories, right? Outsource services or products, right?
Build or buy, right?
That's right. Exactly.
It's either build or buy, right?
Precisely. Yeah. And then it's like, okay, well, how do we know that they're doing what they say they're doing when it comes to, security, right? In the absence of real third-party risk management problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
We started with sort of the questionnaires, right? And then some people wanted to ask 800 questions. It's like, well, you're going to crush your vendors because they're going to be spending all this time answering questions. So we learned that's not working so well, right?
Mm-hmm.
We try footprinting a little bit, like, hey, if you can, go out and footprint them and try to get an understanding of who they're talking to and see if there's any red flags there. And so there's all these sort of techniques out there. The three major things that really matter are, one, what do they have access to, right? It all goes back to like knowing your critical assets, right? Or assets. Do you even know what you have? Like that's a whole different category.
And that's a whole, we've had some episodes where people are like, you don't understand. People don't even know what they have on their network. And I'm like, come on. And they're like, no, really, like really getting a real practical knowledge of not only what's connected, but what is that have access to, all that whole visibility. A lot of organizations simply don't have it.
David, that's a spot on. It's really hard. I would say almost nobody, except for very small businesses who are just getting started, have a real understanding of what their asset inventory looks like, much less what's critical, like to the business processes and also the data that are on it. Mm-hmm. And so back to the main point, that's the problem, right? If we think about it through the lens of like the problem solving, right? Like what's the problem? Problem is we don't have a good grip on our assets. Okay. Why is that complicated? Well, if we don't know what we own and what's important, we don't know what to defend, right? Which means we don't know what our third parties are connecting to. I mean, we may or we may not, right? But we don't know holistically. We may or may not know what we rely on as a business to keep the business going, right? Yeah. And if we don't know that, there's no way to manage it.
And that's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right.
And then layer number three is if we don't know how to manage it, we certainly can't measure it. So, I mean, that always creeps into the conversation at some point. It's like, well, if you don't know how to manage it, if you don't know what you're managing, then you certainly don't know how to measure it. Right. And now all of a sudden,
so there's no way of knowing whether what we're doing is good or not.
Precisely.
Right.
Yeah.
Or if it's enough, because that's why it's complicated, because when we think of every organization has, their security, and it's almost like a set of dials for risk, right? Mm-hmm. Some organizations are like, we're in growth mode, dial that risk up. We're going to take the risk because we've got to grow, right? We're not going to invest here. We're going to invest here. But then at a certain point, they have to protect it. And then their security will increase, or they're going to dial down that risk. They're going to invest, put layers, resources, etc. But they won't know how to do that or what to do if they don't know those things. If they don't know what they have, what their vendors have, what they have access to, how to measure it, how to manage it, they're kind of flying blind, aren't they?
David, that's 100%. And think of it and this applies everywhere. If we don't know what's critical to the business, mm-hmm. right? We don't know how to protect it, and we certainly don't know how to apply resources against it. Right. And we don't know what third parties are connecting to it. And this is the challenge. Right. And it's really hard, but it's I don't want to say you're make a business case for like 100% great asset inventory, which, I'd love to make. Right. Yeah. But the reality is, if we don't know what's important to the business, we don't know what we're protecting. And then we certainly can't provide insights on them. And this is the same for all things, because think about the threat. Let's run some quick scenarios. Like think about where everybody's sitting right now in security. We all have a different lens. Let's say this way. We're all looking at it from a slightly different lens, right? And we all have different responsibilities to manage our one area in that, right? Be it the network, be it assets, be it the management side, be it third-party risk, be it disaster recovery, like whatever, right? We haven't even talked compliance and GRC, right? What the issue is, we're all looking at it slightly differently. And what was missing is that view of like, okay, what problem are we actually solving? Right. We're solving a risk problem that has to do with impact to the organization. Will the organization be hurt, right, by an activity, right, in cyber, right, an information technology issue, right, that is a security issue that will raise the level of cost to the business higher than the business is ready to afford.
Right.
Real
the
impact.
ROI. Like, what is the ROI to solving the problem?
And that's where we end up, right?
Yep.
How much are we willing to invest right, to get a cost avoidance return on that investment, so we can reduce the quote, material impact to the business. And with that, we start to get into the conversation of risk thresholds, right? How much is enough? But you need a calculus to get there, right? Or not even calculus, just straight math. This is how much these type of incidents. These are assets. If these go down, right? These are the things that are going to impact the business in negative ways. They're gonna increase the cost to the business, right? Which matters, because in business you want to keep your revenue high and your costs low. If you're going to drive up your costs more than revenue, right, you really get upside down, right? And then, are we managing those properly? And if we understand that, that's like the through line, right? If we understand that, no matter where we are in the business, whether we're in disaster recovery, whether we're in compliance, whether we're in the SOC, or we're at the executive level, right, or we're at the oversight board level, if we understand what's important to the business, guess what? We know how to protect it, right? Well, at least we know what the problem looks like, and we know where we can go to try to protect it. Now, the wrinkle here that's really interesting is this gets into the third-party risk and the threat side that we talked about earlier. What the business thinks is important to individuals may not be what the attacker thinks is important. And
explain that. That's an interesting view of it.
Yeah.
I don't hear a lot of people looking at it through that lens.
Yeah. And the great example here is, like, I've said this a number of times in other forums.
Good point. When I think about it, you're right, because the business might think, well, these designs for our new product are really what matters to the hacker. So we're going to lock these down. But our employee rosters and our employee HR stuff is just kind of protected. And the attacker's like, I can extort you really well just getting that. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
That's precisely it.
Yeah.
Understanding what the attacker finds valuable, right, is important, because do they want those designs? Well, I mean, maybe if they're a nation state, sure, right, because that saves billions of dollars of R&D, right? But most attackers can't sell that.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. But they can sell your information. They can sell the employee list to those that want to do other things.
Customer lists, customer data, all that.
That's the unintuitive part, right? It's what the attacker finds important, that they're going to then either monetize or use for whatever nefarious gain. And David, that's the key, right? And if we think about it through that lens, now all of a sudden our problem becomes slightly smaller, right? In that we start saying,
are you protecting the right data?
Or information systems, or whatever the case may be.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah. And this is why, so we've seen this huge uptick in ransomware since, like, I think Atlanta, right? And what's interesting is that was a dying art.
I know. It was kind of like trailing off there. And now it's like they have like matching jackets and their names are, you know what I mean? They're all like high-fiving themselves and like buying, different Bugattis to match each other with like the ransomware name on the license plate. I'm like, what is going on here?
Yeah.
Like, it's crazy.
It's a business.
Yeah. Right? It's a huge business.
Yeah. And when we boil it down, it's like, this is an interesting policy decision that helped to create the business, right? Nobody throws, like, I could see people wanting to throw stones at this, but the reality is, like, it was dying before all this because paying the ransom wasn't a thing. Most advice and most executives, and let's say most, the growing thinking at the time was, don't pay it because you don't know if they have the keys.
Right.
So you may pay the ransom, and it was happening, right? Because and the flip side of that, the attackers weren't buying the keys. It was like, we're going to lock it up, get the cash and run away. And sorry, can't unlock your systems.
Right.
So that word got out, and it's like, oh, don't pay it. Then all of a sudden,
they evolved. They went up. They moved up that maturity scale. They have these platforms where they give you proof of life. If you don't believe that we have it, here's a screenshot of this. Here's a screenshot of your inbox. All that stuff. Like,
that's right. And that's the supply side of the equation. They have your information and could possibly unencrypt it and unlock it, right? So that you can get it back if you pay the fine. That's the price point. But on the demand side, what are the companies making the decision on whether or not to pay the ransom? And if you pay it, chances are that business is going to go up. Prices will go up, right? If you continue to provide the demand for that service and pay for it, the price will go up, and guess what? More people will get into the game, and effectively, that's what's happened, right? Where you see,
and that's part of the reason why the FBI from the beginning was saying, please don't pay this.
Yeah, that
Right.
is one big piece of the reason. Absolutely, because it's like it's the same reason. This is interesting in today's day and age, but like as in the United States of America, there's a policy that says we don't negotiate with terrorists.
Exactly.
Right, and the reason is this is an example of why, right? Same way, right? When I meet a SEAL team, you go hijack a ship off the coast of Somalia, right? It's like it's the same thing. It's like you just don't negotiate. And that way you kill the business model.
Yep.
But if you do negotiate, you've now legitimized the business model. And guess what? You've got supply, demand, and price points right in the center. The more the demand goes up for it, the higher the price goes. And that's effectively where we are. And now you see, David, to your point, like, wow, are they sophisticated? Right.
Yes.
And even I think Klopp, you brought up Klopp with the Neuvik
Well,
thing.
and Lockbit and like some of their platforms are ridiculously advanced.
That's
although we recently had on John DiMaggio, he was explaining that Lockbit, their infrastructure might take some time. It's kind of cracking a little. Like they're claiming they're going to leak data, and it's not even leaked, right? So it's kind of interesting.
And it is, and this is what's interesting. Even Klopp, I think, made over there's a lot of money out there. They made over $500 million, right? At this point, and maybe that's climbing. And the others, what happens is if when you see as a criminal who may or may not have the laws behind you to say this is illegal, or even worse, you may have incentives to do it, right? If there's $500 million sitting out there across, you're
getting into that game. If where you live, it's not, or it's decriminalized essentially, so long as you don't target, the people that are making the laws, then what is the disincentive to have some of the brightest minds in that field?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's what we're kind of up against.
And this is it. And then think about it from a social standpoint. Now you're sitting there and your friends are, driving wicked expensive cars, buying all the expensive watches because there's a ton of money out there. Now you're even more incentivized to do it. And do you really care what the impact of the business is?
Right.
No. I mean, you brought up a little while ago, it's a great episode on, the first recorded death of the baby at the hospital, right? Because of ransomware attack. Like, do they care? I mean, it's hard to say that because I don't know the people, but like,
well, they say they do. From what I understand socially, they have to say they do because they want to attract more affiliates about, we're just doing good work here. We're pen testers. This is just a financial play. Don't you worry. You're not going to get your hands dirty. But at the end of the day, various affiliates are out there and they don't care.
The assumption is that they don't, because you look at it from a system standpoint, like, hey, I'm going to blast. I've got access to all these areas. I can see a flaw or a vulnerability in this. If I burn a 0-day or I don't, maybe it's just a SQL injection. Boom, gone. Like blast. Shoot the big blast and see what comes back, right? So who knows that the calculus is in there of like, oh, there might be a human on the other side of here that's really going to be impacted. And honestly, that's less of the concern from us from the threat side. And the way I think the business side can be thinking about this, right, is more like, look, what do we need to protect so that whoever the threat is that comes at us, we've got a sufficient level of security to defend on most of the attacks we're going to get. And if we get the one off, we're ready to respond. Yeah. And this is the thinking that it's so much fun. Look, I love this space, right? And like, I can go down the rabbit hole on all these really fast, and it's so much fun because it's this inquisitive sort of, what's the mystery and how do I solve it?
Right.
But what's really challenging for business leaders, and especially those in the space, is to pull back and say, okay, what does this have to do with my systems and my networks and my business? Right.
What's my risk in light of all of this?
Precisely. Yeah. And I know it's boring. It's not super attractive. Like, oh, this is cool. This is how the market's moving. But the reality is, if we just have that fundamental through line sort of pulled through, it's like, okay, at the end of the day, we can come back and say, does this threat actually matter to us? Like, is this
Right.
type of ransomware group a problem for us? Are they targeting
Right.
vulnerabilities in our systems that we rely on
Yep.
that we might have? If no, then cool. And you know what?
Right.
From a board perspective, David, or even a briefing perspective, that's actually a really strong argument for some to make. Hey, Move It was a big deal. Here's what happened. Educate. Maybe even I'm kind of thinking through a board discussion here, right?
Right.
Think through like, hey, educate the board on what's going on, because they're going to go out and propagate this information to to their
Yep.
board. You can say, look, here's what's going on. The good news is we don't use Move It. We
Exactly.
don't use that file transfer protocol. In fact, we only use X for file transfer, and here's how we encrypt it, and and all the things that
Right.
we actually do. So it doesn't matter. So now that we've had that fun conversation, can we get to how we're managing our program and what we're doing? And it's a real easy way to pivot.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know that a lot of I think that's so important for CISOs or leaders of security teams to really make that case of, look at the silence that we've avoided. That's a success. That's a security success that we've had, because we chose as a team not to select, not to take risk over here, or not to select this vulnerable product, or not to some of it was luck, right? We chose a different vendor rather than Move It, so hey, we're lucky. But some of it is also like, we chose to buckle down and not take risk over here, and look what's happening to maybe some of our competitors or others in the industry that took that risk, right? There's a business impact, and that's a celebration for them,
Yeah,
right?
David,
So, that can help them make a business case for investing in an initiative that CISO is trying to drive.
yeah, it's almost the don't let a good incident go to waste.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
like everything else, bad incidents make news, right? Like it's when it goes south, that's what makes news. And so the board, if anything went wrong internally, they're going to want to talk about that. But it's like, start it off with explaining all of the good things that have been avoided, right? It's always a challenge, right? Because when they're doing their job great, nobody ever hears about them. Nobody hears from them. It's silence. And that's what you want, right? You want to be out of the news for anything bad, right? You want to be out of the news. You want silence, because that means it's working.
I love the idea of celebrating the wins.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, think of the construct there. You laid it out perfectly, which is this sort of, it gets to the ROI you were mentioning earlier. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, this is what happened to, in Move It. Here's
Yep.
what we bought, and here's what we're doing. And we didn't, we made a decision to go in this direction largely because we were concerned about encryption, or we were concerned about whatever, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
Right. And we made this direction. So we kind of avoided this huge mess.
Yep.
Right. Celebrate that win. Right.
Absolutely. Because that has a business impact to the board, because you didn't have an interruption, right? You didn't have an interruption. You chose the cloud vendor. You spent a little more, but the cloud vendor, let's say, right, has a really good SLA and doesn't have downtime. Look at what's happening over here. They're down for 2-3 weeks a year, unexpected, right? We avoided that because of good, sound decisions. We spent a little more, but we were able to stay profitable and stay productive during that time. Nobody ever brings that up, right? Like it's very rare that they do. And that's something that they need to capture, right? Because that can be measured.
Yeah. Cost avoidance is a
Yeah,
thing.
cost avoidance.
Yeah. And it's a great example of why we exist in the world, right?
Yeah,
Keep the
exactly
cost
right.
low, keep the impact cost low while spending resources, right? Appropriately.
It's hard to make those business cases of ROI when you're talking, like it's hard
Mhm.
because cybersecurity is expensive. Like some of the practitioners are some of the brightest minds in technology, right? And they're really good. And to have that, you know, it costs a little more, but if you can make that ROI and point to it, I think it's so critical.
Yeah.
That's just amazing. So tell us a little bit before we go, just and again, I want to urge everybody to check out Ryan's book, Understand, Manage, and Measure Cyber Risk, because it's practical. It's even called practical solutions for creating a sustainable cyber program. But forget the buzzwords there. Like, it's really good, Ryan. Like, you synthesize things and you give people practical kind of tear sheets that they can use today. They can use it this week in their organization. Really good stuff. So link is in the show notes. I encourage you guys to check it out because it's really good. Whether you're in technology, whether you're a business owner, a decision maker, or leader in a larger organization, just check it out. It's really good. I'm telling you. But share with us, you were in the Pentagon. How did you start? How did you get to the Pentagon?
Yeah.
Kind of a cool gig, man. I'm just saying, like it's pretty cool. So
Yeah.
walk us through it.
Perfect. Thanks for that.
And tell us all of the secrets that you learned there.
There are no secrets. I know. There's nothing to see here. Yeah, for me, it was actually, I don't think anybody in this space really sort of, I don't know. It's hard when you get into this space. It's like everybody comes at it from a different angle, right? So for mine was like I sort of had the deviant mind, right? I was trying to break out of stuff when I was a kid in a boarding school. I realized like, oh, I can get what action on objectives I want if I just do X, Y, Z and try to go stealth, right? To then fell in love with technology. And so I was building databases. I was with IBM. I went to grad school. I was in the middle of grad school and I grew up outside of New York. And the towers came down in 9/11. Yeah. So for those that are listening, that's a long time ago.
Yeah, I'm always shocked when I have to explain. Like, I mean, yeah, we read about it in a book. I'm like, you read about it in a book? Like, I know exactly where I was when I heard about it, and then I watched the second plane go into the tower. Like, I remember it like it was yesterday.
Me too. And that was a pivotal point in my life because I decided, all right, I want to turn my attention to the federal government and defend against that. Like I'm a defender at the end of the day, right?
Absolutely.
Drummer in a band, goalie in soccer. Like I always feel like I'm a person's keeping the beat and the last line of defense. So when that happens, it's like, oh, I'm going in. And then my buddies that were in uniform are like, oh, now you're going to put the uniform on, pal?
I know.
Like, okay, fair point. And so the dean of my university approached me because she'd heard me talking about this and said, hey, I can, put you on this list for the Presidential Mission Fellow Program. It's sort of a 2-year sponsorship out of the White House and OPM runs it to go to the federal government. And I'm like, sure. So I applied thinking, I'm up against like some wicked smart policy people and all this. And I'm an MBA, in finance and systems thinking. And I'm like, there's no way I'm getting this job.
Right.
And I did. And so what happened was I went to the DOD to build I was in systems development at the time to build a database. Yeah, it had a ton of really important information in it. And I wound up, so this is the third piece, right, of how I got into cyber writ large. So I was building this and I got to the point where I was going to put it on the systems. And remember, cyber was information insurance. And we were going through these systems checks and I'm like, I can break almost every one of those checks. And so we had built the system in a way that was literally, I won't go through the details publicly, but built it in a way that was quite frankly, really hard to get any information out of it. Nearly, and I know what I'm saying here, nearly impossible because like that was the challenge I put to the team. I'm like, look, zero data loss, full stop. Like that's our goal, zero.
Was that remember the OPM breach? That was part of that whole where those indictments came down. There was like the Equifax breach, the Anthem breach, and that was that after that.
It's before it.
It was before it.
Yeah, it's from the beginning. Yeah, literally, David. This was in 2000. So this goes to the deviant mind side. It's like, I know how I would break this. So no matter what I'm building, if I'm responsible for it, I'm protecting it. Full stop.
Wow.
Yeah.
Holy cow.
And so later, this was in 2002.
Oh my gosh, this is okay. Wow, this is more than a decade earlier. Okay.
And that's why this is before they started tightening up the IA stuff. So I'm like, wait a minute. I'm like, this information assurance isn't really information assurance. It's like a check in the block. And like, guys, we got to do better. So that got me pulled into, at the time was called cyber warfare. It was highly classified at the time because it was before 2011 when we decided the Department of Defense came out and said, yep, we do offensive cyber operations. Yeah. So I went and did that for about 8 years and it was fun. Yeah.
That's phenomenal. And Neuvik today, where's your footprint? Where's your market? What all are you doing? I know that we got introduced by my buddy Josh Mason, who's a phenomenal, great guy and great human, but also brilliant mind.
Yeah, no, he's so much fun.
He's really cool.
I could sit and talk to him for hours and have.
I know, I have too. Yeah, I think our episode was like an hour or something, but we could have gone on for like 3-4 hours. It was just tons of stories and
I
everything
know.
else.
So great. Like, I love that thinking, right? Because you can
Yeah.
see, and you see how it all gets pieced together. Like, wow, that's brilliant. Yeah.
And he has facial expressions. Sorry, Josh, but he's facial expressions. So when he's thinking, you can kind of see it. You're like, oh, something else is coming.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it's like, it's really interesting.
Yeah. It's
I
like,
like
wait
it.
for it. Wait for
Yeah,
it. There
exactly.
it is.
There.
Yeah. No, he's great. Love him to death. I forgot the question. What's the question?
Neuvik, what's your
Oh, yeah.
footprint? What are you guys, what initiatives are you guys driving? Do you guys do consulting, leadership advice? Are you doing pen testing for organizations? What all are you doing for organizations in this space?
Yeah, we do what we think the three fundamental pieces are, right? We do the vulnerability assessments. That's the
Mm-hmm.
pen testing, but mostly red teaming,
Yep.
run by Dave Mayer, and he's a SANS instructor. Moses
Yep.
Frost also teaches one of the SANS courses, and is there, and Jean Mays, who we just picked up, also there. So we do a lot of that sort of advanced. We call it advanced assessment. So wherever you're trying to look for vulnerabilities, like, we'll point at them and find out where the vulnerability is. Now, here's the important piece. We then take that and pull it through risk management. So why do these vulnerabilities matter? What
for the business impact on it?
That's right. It's like, why does this matter to you? And more importantly, how can you fix them, and when do you need to fix them? Right. The pieces that are like, oh, right, I've got to actually remediate these at some level.
Right.
Yes, you do. And here's when, and here's how, and here's specifically like how to do it. So that's our risk management piece, right? We do some consulting on risk management on programs and stuff, but largely people go to the big firms for that. But we're highly capable in that space. Naturally, the book is kind of a centerpiece there. And then the other piece is training, led by Tillery and team and Elle and others, who actually look at the individual and say, all right, what skills are you missing in your software development lifecycle, right? Are you doing threat modeling? Are you doing this? And we train big swaths of teams to think about security up front, right? Back to the castle discussion we had earlier, right? It's like, if you're going to build it with security in mind up front, and then eliminate classes of attacks and impact downstream. And that's our training team, run by Tillery.
And I love that analogy you gave earlier, where they make the staircases go counterclockwise, because then it's harder for right-handed people to swing an axe at you walking up that way.
And
that's exactly the approach.
Exactly. And it's a lot easier for a defender who would be right-handed to swing an axe towards you.
Yeah.
So, yeah, think of it up front. And all of a sudden you've eliminated, outside of a lot of left-handers,
right,
which exists. Well, my dad's one of them. You've eliminated a swath of attackers or of threats simply because of their capabilities, right? And then, of course, if you sit on top of the crossbow, you can pick them off easier because it's so you got 2 layers of defense before you even put a person in the castle. And so our training side kind of helps organizations think through those from an SDLC, DevSecOps, side of the house. Like, let's think about it up front while we're building the applications, right? Or the networks, or whatever the case might be, but largely in application development, and push that through so that, as an organization, you have less problems, less security issues downstream.
That's fantastic. And we will have links to the Neuvik website. So we encourage everybody to check that out as well. So Ryan, I got to tell you, phenomenal conversation. You are welcome back anytime. I really would love to pick your brain as more events happen and everything else. And I encourage everybody to get this book. And I genuinely mean that. I mean, it's really good, and it's got so many practical implications. So congratulations, and I wish you a ton of success, my friend.
Thank you, David. Really appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. And I love your episodes. Like, it's so great to be here. So thank you.
No, phenomenal stuff. I can't wait to get over by you when next time I'm visiting there. I'm gonna come grab coffee with you.
That would be great.
Great stuff, man. Fantastic episode.
Excellent.
All right, everybody, check out Ryan and team and the book, and we will talk to everybody later. Thanks so much, Ryan. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
All right, my friend.
Talk
soon.
Talk to you later.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Well, that wraps this up. Thanks for joining, everybody. Hope you got value out of digging deeper behind the scenes of security and cybercrime today. Please don't forget to help keep this going by subscribing free to our YouTube channel at Cybercrime Junkies Podcast, and download and enjoy all of our past episodes on Apple and Spotify podcasts so we can continue to bring you more of what matters. This is Cybercrime Junkies.